The day I told my kids I couldn't afford groceries, they laughed and said, "Eat less then." But they didn't know I'd inherited $4.2 million the night before. So I decided to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. Hi everyone, my name is Linda, and before I tell you this story that completely changed my relationship with my children forever, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Are you joining me from Texas, California, Florida, or maybe somewhere international? Drop your location in the comments below because I love connecting with all of you wonderful people from around the world. Now, what I'm about to share with you happened just 6 months ago, and it's a story about family, money, and the moment I realized my own children had lost all respect for the woman who raised them. But sometimes, life has a funny way of giving you exactly what you need at exactly the right moment. Let me take you back to March 15th of this year. I was 67 years old, living in the same modest 2-bedroom house in suburban Ohio that my late husband Frank and I had bought 35 years earlier. Frank had passed away 3 years ago from a heart attack, and since then, I'd been struggling to make ends meet on just my Social Security and a small pension from the school district where I'd worked as a secretary for 28 years. My 3 children, Michael, Jennifer, and David, were all in their 40s now. Michael was a successful real estate agent, Jennifer worked as a nurse practitioner, and David owned a small but profitable accounting firm. All of them were doing well for themselves, married with children of their own, living in houses that were easily worth 3 times what mine was. But here's the thing about success. Sometimes it makes people forget where they came from. For months, I'd been falling behind on bills. The heating costs during the harsh Ohio winter had been brutal. My old car needed expensive repairs, and my prescription medications seemed to get more expensive every month. I'd been too proud to ask my children for help, trying to manage on my own like I always had. That Tuesday evening, I was standing in my kitchen, staring at my nearly empty refrigerator and the stack of unpaid bills on my counter. I had exactly $43 in my checking account, and it was still 2 weeks until my Social Security check arrived. My pantry had some canned soup, a box of crackers, and not much else. I made a decision that I thought was reasonable. I'd ask my children if they could help me with some groceries just until my check came in. These were my kids, the same children I'd sacrificed everything for, who I'd fed, clothed, and put through college despite Frank and me often going without. I called Michael first. His wife answered, and I could hear laughter and the sounds of a dinner party in the background. When Michael finally came to the phone, I could tell he was annoyed at being interrupted. "Mom, what's wrong now?" he said, not even bothering with a hello. I swallowed my pride and explained my situation as gently as I could. "Honey, I'm having a tough month with the bills, and I was wondering if you might be able to help me with some groceries, just until my check comes in." There was a long pause. Then I heard him sigh heavily. "Mom, you really need to learn to budget better. Jennifer and I were just talking about this last week. You can't keep living like money grows on trees." "Michael, I've budgeted every penny. The heating bill was just so high this winter, and my medications—" "Look, Mom, we all have expenses. My kids have activities, the mortgage, college funds to think about. Maybe you should consider moving to a smaller place or, I don't know, eating less. You don't need to eat as much as you did when you were younger anyway." The words hit me like a physical blow. Eating less. My own son was suggesting I should go hungry rather than ask my financially comfortable children for help. "Michael, I'm not asking for money, just maybe some groceries to get me through." "I've got to go, Mom. My guests are waiting. We'll talk later." The line went dead. I sat there for a moment, phone still in my hand, trying to process what had just happened. Then I called Jennifer. Jennifer's response was somehow worse. When I explained my situation, she actually laughed, a cold, dismissive sound that I'd never heard from my daughter before. "Oh, Mom, you're being dramatic again. Look, Brad and I just booked a cruise for next month, and with the kids' sports and everything, we're stretched pretty thin. Besides, you always manage to figure things out. You're tougher than you think." "Jennifer, I'm not being dramatic. I literally have $43. "Mom, stop. You raised 3 kids on much less than what you get now. You just need to prioritize better. Maybe eat less. Cook more meals at home instead of buying convenience foods." There it was again. Eat less. My daughter, who I'd nursed through every childhood illness, whose college tuition I'd helped pay for by taking on extra work at the school, was telling me to eat less instead of offering to buy her struggling mother a bag of groceries. I called David last, hoping maybe my youngest would show some compassion. David had always been the most sensitive of my children, or so I thought. "David, honey, I'm in a bit of a tight spot this month." "Let me guess. You need money," he interrupted before I could even finish explaining. "Not money, just some help with groceries until—" "Mom, Lisa, and I have been talking, and we think you might have a spending problem. You're always calling with some emergency or another. Maybe if you ate less and bought generic brands instead of name brands, you wouldn't be in this position." Eat less. The third time in one evening. "David, I buy the cheapest groceries I can find. I use coupons. I shop sales. Look, Mom, I love you, but we can't keep enabling this behavior. You need to learn to live within your means. Lisa thinks maybe you should consider downsizing to a senior community where meals are included." The conversation ended the same way as the others, with my child hanging up on me. I sat in my quiet kitchen that night, staring at those bills and that empty refrigerator, feeling more alone and betrayed than I ever had in my life. These were the children I'd given everything for. When Michael wanted to play Little League but we couldn't afford the equipment, Frank and I had skipped meals for weeks to save up the money. When Jennifer needed her wisdom teeth removed and our insurance wouldn't cover it, I'd taken on weekend cleaning jobs to pay for the surgery. When David wanted to go to that expensive summer computer camp, I'd sold my grandmother's jewelry to make it happen. And now, when their mother needed help buying groceries, not money, not a loan, just food, they'd all told me to eat less and manage better. But here's where the story takes a turn that none of us could have predicted. At exactly 11:30 that night, my phone rang. It was Harold Pemberton, an attorney from Seattle that I'd never heard of before. "Mrs. Linda Hartwell?" he asked. "Yes, that's me." "I'm calling regarding the estate of your uncle, Theodore Hartwell." I was confused. Uncle Ted had died when I was 12 years old. My father's older brother, a man I barely remembered except for the fact that he'd never married and had moved to Seattle for some business opportunity decades ago. "I'm sorry, sir, but my uncle passed away over 50 years ago." "No, ma'am. Theodore Hartwell passed away 6 months ago at the age of 94. According to our records, you are his closest living relative and the sole beneficiary of his estate." My mind was reeling. "That's impossible. We lost touch with Uncle Ted when I was just a child. My parents told me he died." "Mrs. Hartwell, your parents may have lost touch with Theodore, but he never lost touch with you. He hired investigators over the years to keep track of your family. He knew when you got married, when your children were born, when your husband passed away. He's been following your life from a distance for decades." I was sitting down now, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles were white. "I don't understand. Why would he—" Theodore Hartwell became quite wealthy through real estate investments and technology stocks. He never had children of his own, and according to the documentation he left, he was very specific that his estate should go to the family member who, in his words, showed the most character and integrity throughout their life. The attorney continued. He left detailed notes about why he chose you, Mrs. Hartwell. He mentions your dedication to your family, your work and education, how you cared for your husband during his illness, and how you've maintained your dignity despite financial hardships after his death. I was crying now, tears streaming down my face as this stranger told me things about myself that my own children seemed to have forgotten. "Mrs. Hartwell, after taxes and legal fees, you're inheriting approximately $4.2 million. $4.2 million. I had to ask him to repeat it 3 times because I simply couldn't process what he was saying. At 11:30 on the same night that my 3 children had told me to eat less rather than help me buy groceries, I'd become a multimillionaire. But here's what my children didn't know about me. I wasn't just a weak old woman who couldn't manage her money. I was the daughter of Depression-era parents who had taught me the value of every penny. I was a woman who had stretched every dollar to raise 3 children and put them through college. I knew exactly how much things cost and exactly what it meant to sacrifice for family. And I was about to teach my children the most expensive lesson of their lives. The next morning, I called the attorney back and made arrangements to have the inheritance transferred to my accounts. By Thursday, I was officially worth over $4 million. But I didn't tell anyone. Not my neighbors, not my friend Margaret from church, and certainly not my children. Instead, I went grocery shopping. I bought everything I'd been denying myself for months. Fresh salmon, good steaks, organic vegetables, real butter, premium ice cream. I filled my cart without looking at a single price tag. The total came to over $200, more than I'd normally spend on groceries in a month, and I paid for it without blinking. Then I went home and started making plans. On Friday, exactly 1 week after my children had told me to eat less, I called each of them again. Michael, I wanted to thank you for your advice about eating less and budgeting better. You were absolutely right, and I've made some changes. Oh, that's good, Mom. I'm glad you're being more realistic about your situation. Yes, very realistic. In fact, I've decided to be much more careful about where I invest my time and money. Speaking of which, I need to let you know that I won't be available to babysit the grandchildren anymore. I think it's time I focused on my own priorities. There was a pause. Michael had been counting on my free babysitting for years, especially during his and his wife's date nights and weekend trips. Mom, what do you mean? The kids love spending time with you, and Sarah and I really depend on... Oh, I'm sure you'll figure something out. You're good at managing expenses, remember? I'm sure you can budget for a babysitter. I made similar calls to Jennifer and David, withdrawing my free grandmother services and letting them know I wouldn't be available for the holiday hosting duties I'd been handling for years either. What do you mean you can't host Easter? Jennifer demanded. You always host Easter. Where are we supposed to go? I'm sure you'll think of something, honey. Maybe one of your nice houses would work. You know, the houses that are worth 3 times what mine is. But that was just the beginning. Over the next month, I quietly began implementing what I came to think of as the eating less plan. First, I hired a financial advisor, not just any financial advisor, but the most expensive and exclusive one in the city. I told him I wanted to restructure my entire life and make some significant investments in my future happiness. Then I put my house on the market, not because I couldn't afford it, but because I was ready for something better. I found a beautiful 2-bedroom condo in a luxury senior community about 40 minutes away. The kind of place with a concierge, a pool, organized activities, and most importantly, a dining room where meals were included. While my house was selling, I also made some other purchases. I bought a brand new Honda CR-V to replace my 15-year-old car that was constantly breaking down. I booked a 2-week cruise to Alaska, something Frank and I had always talked about doing, but never could afford. I also bought myself a whole new wardrobe, quality clothes that made me feel confident and beautiful. But the most important thing I did was hire a private investigator. I know that might sound extreme, but I wanted to understand exactly how well my children were really doing financially. If they were truly struggling and couldn't help their mother buy groceries, then I needed to know that. But if they were just being selfish, well, that was information I needed too. What the investigator found was enlightening, to say the least. Michael had over $800,000 in investment accounts, owned 3 rental properties in addition to his primary residence, and had recently spent $15,000 on a luxury vacation to Hawaii that he'd posted all over social media. Jennifer and her husband had a combined income of over $200,000 a year, owned their home outright, and had recently spent $12,000 renovating their kitchen, with granite countertops that cost more than my entire yearly medication budget. David's accounting firm was doing extremely well, pulling in nearly $300,000 annually. He and Lisa had just bought a new boat for $38,000 and were planning to build a swimming pool that would cost $50,000. All three of my children were not just comfortable, they were wealthy. Combined, my three children had assets worth well over $2 million, and they had told their struggling mother to eat less rather than spend $50 on groceries. The irony was devastating. While I'd been rationing my medications, skipping meals, and wearing the same worn-out clothes for years, my children had been living lives of comfort that I'd helped make possible through all my sacrifices. Every piano lesson, every school trip, every college expense I'd covered by working extra jobs and going without. It had all led to this moment where they couldn't spare the cost of a dinner out to help their mother eat. That's when I decided they needed to learn what eating less really meant. But this wouldn't be about cruelty or revenge. This would be about education, teaching them the real value of family, money, and basic human decency. I started with Michael. It was a Saturday morning when I called him, exactly 6 weeks after our original grocery conversation. "Michael, honey, I have some exciting news to share with you and the family. Could you and Sarah bring the kids over for lunch today? I'm making pot roast." He sounded pleased and surprised. "Really, Mom? That's great. We'll be there at 1. When they arrived, I had set the table beautifully with my good china, the wedding set that Frank and I had received 40 years ago and only used for special occasions. I had prepared an amazing meal, pot roast that had been slow cooking for 8 hours, homemade mashed potatoes with real butter, green bean casserole made from scratch, fresh dinner rolls that I'd baked that morning, and apple pie for dessert with a lattice crust that took me 2 hours to perfect. The kind of feast I used to make for Sunday dinners when the kids were young and money was even tighter than it was now. The smell filled the entire house, and when Michael's youngest grandson hugged my legs and said, "Grandma, this smells like Christmas," I almost lost my resolve. Almost. But then I remembered sitting alone in my kitchen 6 weeks ago, wondering if I had enough food to last until my Social Security check, and my determination returned. During the meal, I was the perfect grandmother and mother-in-law, asking about Michael's latest real estate deals, complimenting Sarah on her new haircut, playing peekaboo with the baby, and laughing at Michael's stories about difficult clients. I helped cut the children's food, wiped faces, and made sure everyone had seconds, the same way I'd been doing for decades, putting everyone else's needs before my own. My grandchildren were delighted to have Grandma cooking for them again. 7-year-old Emma told me it was the best pot roast in the world, and 10-year-old Jake asked if I could teach him how to make my dinner rolls. Their innocent joy made what I was about to do even more heartbreaking, but also more necessary. Then, over dessert, I made my announcement. "I have something wonderful to tell you all. Remember when I called asking for help with groceries a few weeks ago?" Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mom, we talked about this. You need to budget better." "Oh, but that's just it, sweetheart. I took your advice completely to heart. In fact, I've been doing so much thinking about budgeting and priorities that I've made some big decisions." I pulled out a folder of documents that I'd prepared. You see, it turns out I inherited some money from Uncle Ted. Quite a bit of money, actually. $4.2 million, to be exact. The silence that fell over my dining room was deafening. Sarah's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Michael's face went completely white. $4.2 million? Sarah whispered, her fork clattering against her plate. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Yes, and it's made me realize so much about family priorities and who we choose to invest in. Michael, do you remember what you told me when I asked for help buying groceries? He was staring at me like I'd grown a second head, his face cycling through shock, confusion, and what looked like growing panic. Mom, we didn't know. If I had known about the inheritance. But that's exactly the point, Michael. The inheritance came the night after our phone call. What matters is what you said when you thought your mother was just a poor, struggling old woman with no other options. I could see him trying to calculate in his head, trying to figure out how to fix this, but some things can't be undone with quick thinking or smooth talking. You told me to eat less. You said I needed to learn to budget better. You said you had your own expenses to worry about. I slid a piece of paper across the table to him, watching his face go even whiter as he recognized his own financial information. This is a printout of your investment portfolio, Michael. $800,000 in stocks and bonds alone. This is your property value report. Your primary residence worth $450,000 plus 3 rental properties worth a combined $700,000 more. Sarah let out a small gasp. I don't think even she had realized the full extent of their wealth. Your net worth is over $1.5 million, Michael. You told your hungry mother to eat less rather than spend $50 on groceries when you could have bought her a year's worth of food with your monthly investment returns alone. Michael grabbed the paper, his hands shaking. How did you get this? This is private. What's private, Michael, is having to choose between medication and food. What's private is sitting in your house wondering if your own children care whether you starve. What's not private anymore is exactly who you've become. I stood up and walked to my front door, opening it wide. I think it's time for you to leave now. And Michael, don't call me anymore asking for free babysitting. I think you should budget for a real babysitter from now on. Mom, you can't be serious. As serious as hunger, sweetheart. As serious as eating less. They left without saying another word, and I watched through my window as Michael sat in his car for 10 minutes, probably trying to process what had just happened. The next day, I called Jennifer and invited her family for dinner on Wednesday. Jennifer was thrilled. Mom, this is so nice. We've been wondering why you've been so distant lately. I'll bring wine. Wednesday's dinner was even more elaborate than Saturday's. I'd made Jennifer's favorite, chicken and dumplings, along with all the sides she'd loved as a child. Her husband Brad complimented everything, and my grandchildren were delighted to have Grandma cooking for them again. Just like with Michael, I waited until dessert. Jennifer, honey, I wanted to thank you for the advice you gave me about eating less and prioritizing better. It really got me thinking about my spending habits. Jennifer smiled, looking pleased with herself. I'm so glad, Mom. Sometimes we all need a reality check about our finances. Absolutely. In fact, your advice was so helpful that I want to share some exciting news with you. I inherited some money recently. Quite a lot of money. I told her the same story I'd told Michael, watching her face change from confusion to shock to something that looked almost like panic. Jennifer, when I called you asking for help with groceries, do you remember what you said? Mom, if I had known, you laughed at me. I let that sink in for a moment. Your mother called you, desperate for food, and you laughed. Then you told me to eat less and cook more meals at home instead of buying convenience foods. I slid her financial information across the table, bank statements, property values, investment accounts. You make over $200,000 a year. You own your home free and clear. You just spent $12,000 on a kitchen renovation. I pointed to a specific line item. Your granite countertops cost $3,000. That's more than I spend on food in an entire year. Jennifer was crying now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of panic, realizing what she'd lost. Mom, we can talk about this. Family is family, right? You're absolutely right, sweetheart. Family is family. That's exactly why a daughter should help her struggling mother buy groceries instead of telling her to eat less. But you taught me that my definition of family might be too generous. I walked to the door again. I think you should leave now, Jennifer. And please don't call anymore expecting me to host holidays. I'm sure your beautiful house with the expensive kitchen can handle Easter dinner. Mom, please. Goodbye, Jennifer. By the time I had the same conversation with David the following week, word had clearly gotten around. He arrived. At my house, nervous and apologetic, immediately launching into explanations and excuses before he even sat down. Mom, Michael told me about Uncle Ted's inheritance. I'm so happy for you, and I want to apologize if I seemed unsupportive when you called about groceries. I was having a bad day at work and... David, sit down and eat your dinner. We'll talk afterward. He was jumpy throughout the entire meal, barely eating despite the fact that I'd made his favorite. meatloaf and mashed potatoes. When dessert time came, he was practically vibrating with anxiety. "David, you told me to eat less. You also said Lisa thought I might have a spending problem." I placed his financial documents on the table. "Your accounting firm makes nearly $300,000 a year. You just bought a $38,000 boat. You're planning a $50,000 swimming pool. Mom, I know how this looks. It looks like my son makes more money in 1 year than most people see in 5 years, and he told his hungry mother to eat less instead of offering to buy her a loaf of bread." David was crying openly now. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking." "You were thinking that your mother was a burden instead of a priority. You were thinking that your boat and your pool were more important than your mother's dignity. What can I do? How can I fix this?" I looked at my youngest child, the boy I'd sacrificed so much for, the child who'd told me to eat less, and I felt something break inside my chest that I knew would never heal. "David, you can't fix this. Some things, once broken, can't be repaired. You can't unsay words. You can't unfeel the feeling of calling your child for help and being told to eat less. Please, Mom, there has to be something. The something you could have done was help your mother buy groceries when she asked. The something you could have done was say, 'Of course, Mom, let me bring some food over right now.' That was your something, and you chose not to do it." He left sobbing, and I felt absolutely no guilt about it. The next few months were the most peaceful I'd experienced in years. I moved into my beautiful new condo where my neighbors were interesting people my own age who treated me with respect and kindness. I went on my Alaska cruise and met wonderful people from all over the country. I started taking art classes and joined a book club. My children called. They called constantly. Michael called crying about how sorry he was and how he'd learned his lesson. He offered to pay for my groceries forever, to buy me a new car, to do anything to make up for his cruelty. I listened politely and then told him I wasn't interested in anything he had to offer. Jennifer sent flowers, cards, long letters explaining how she'd been under stress and didn't mean what she'd said. She offered to take me on vacation to buy me jewelry to renovate my entire condo. I thanked her for the thought and declined everything. David showed up at my condo unannounced multiple times, begging for forgiveness and bringing expensive gifts. I accepted his visits politely but briefly and gave his gifts to charity. You see, what my children didn't understand was that this was never about the money. It was about respect. It was about basic human decency. It was about the fact that when your mother calls you hungry, you feed her. You don't calculate whether she deserves it or whether she's budgeting properly. You feed her because she's your mother and she fed you. They had shown me exactly who they were when they thought I had nothing. Now that they knew I had everything, they wanted to show me different versions of themselves, but I'd already seen enough. 6 months later, I made one final decision about my inheritance. I called all 3 of them and invited them to lunch at an expensive restaurant downtown. They all came, probably thinking this was their chance for reconciliation. Over appetizers, I told them about my new life, my condo, my cruises, my art classes, my new friends. They listened eagerly, probably hoping for an invitation back into my world. Then, over the main course, I told them about the charitable foundation I was establishing. I've decided to donate the majority of Uncle Ted's inheritance to create a foundation that provides emergency assistance to senior citizens facing food insecurity. It will help elderly people buy groceries when they can't afford them. The table went silent. The foundation will be called the Eat Less Foundation, and it will specifically help seniors whose adult children have failed to provide support during financial emergencies. Jennifer started crying again. Michael looked like he was going to be sick. David stared at his plate. "I'm donating $3.8 million to start the foundation. I'm keeping enough for my living expenses and to ensure I never have to ask anyone for help again." "Mom," Michael whispered, "that money was meant for family." Yes, it was. And now it's going to help families. Real families where children take care of their parents instead of telling them to eat less. I paid for lunch, kissed each of them on the cheek, and told them I hoped they'd learn something valuable about family priorities.